mentioned in a report nearly half of companies that you spoke to saying that their accumulated data is a competitive moat.
That is absolutely the case, because right now, if you're just looking at intelligence, AI labs have essentially sucked up all of the public data that's available to train their systems. You want to have a differentiation with other companies in your industry, then having lots of customer data, lots of transactional data, industry data, materials data, those are going to help you make better decisions.
If you were a CIO sitting on an AI budget, how to think about building this orchestration layer, because obviously it's a fast-moving market and new models come out every week.
I think the key is making sure that it is model independent. Every week there's a different model that could be the best, and you don't want to be locked into a certain one.
What's the one finding that you kind of took away that every kind of CEO or CIO should be thinking about?
Rather than being overly focused on cost cutting, they should be thinking about, how can I bring a new line of service in? How can I improve the quality of response time to my customer by 10x? How can I get a new way to use this data to offer something that wasn't available before that keeps my customer more sticky? There needs to be new metrics that goes beyond reducing cost.
This is Matthew Cheung, and today I'm joined by Alvin Wang Graylin, who is a digital fellow of the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. He has 35 or more than 35 years experience in both the US and China across AI, XR, semiconductor chips, cybersecurity. He's worked in some big name companies like HTC, Intel, and IBM. He's an investor in over 100 startups. Is author of Our Next Reality, which is about how the AI-powered metaverse will reshape the world, and is also advisor to governments and Fortune 100 companies on AI policy, governance, and the post-AGI socio-economic transition. So today we're going to be talking about the Enterprise AI Playbook, which is co-authored by Alvin at the Stanford Digital Economy Lab. So Alvin, thanks for joining us today.
No, thanks, Matt. Good to see you again. It's been a while since we last chatted.
So I think jumping straight into the report that you wrote. So you went and surveyed, over 50 enterprise companies to see how they're adopting AI, and it was quite interesting actually, because it was the middle of the summer of 2025 when that MIT report came out talking about how 95% of AI projects fail, and that actually caused a bit of a crash in the S&P.
Yeah.
Or is a little bit.
And I think that was actually, not necessarily representative, right? In the sense of, and this is actually what we did differently, because they just used a survey and they had people fill out forms. What we did actually was to have long-length conversations with 50 companies and to get actual operating data from these companies. So we knew, what they spent, what they did, how they thought about it, what was their actual returns on investments. And I think it's that level of depth is what's needed to really understand what's actually happening in the real world today.
So it's a great read, and we'll drop the link into the comments of this. But the chapters I want to kind of double click on and investigate with you, because they're very pertinent in the world of capital markets, which ipushpull deals in. One of them is around kind of human oversight or human in the loop, and some of your findings from that was talking about how if AI handles things autonomously versus a humans only kind of process, there's some big productivity gains to be had there. So how would you when you were talking to companies, how are companies generally dealing with that kind of autonomy, the slider piece where you've got humans on one side and full autonomy on another?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually one of the more important questions right now, because these systems are getting more and more capable. And to be honest, when we went through this process, it was changing. It took about 6 months to do the data gatherings, and during that 6 months, the technology was advancing, and the capabilities and the ability for it to be more autonomous was changing on a weekly basis. So, towards the end, we actually had more companies that was looking into greater levels of automation and delegation. And what we also did find was companies that did that will have, in general, on average, a significantly higher return in terms of productivity gains, and they were somewhere around 70% compared to 20 or 40% for the high automation versus the full human in the loop. I guess the key was not everything is actually fully automatable, right? So really, how do you select which ones do you prioritize? And I think the key was, is it repetitive and is it reversible? And if it's both of those things, then full automation really probably is the best option, and it's going to be the highest return, the lowest cost, the easier to implement. So.
And can you just talk through the different, I suppose, bandings of human in the loop levels that you had in the report? So you talk about collaboration, approval, escalation. Can you talk a bit more what that looks like in the wild?
Yeah, so essentially, somewhere essentially every single step a human has to review and approve. That's kind of the lowest form, and then there's the one where the AI does something and then you escalate it. The full automation is essentially, and then you escalate things that the AI cannot handle. The full automation, essentially, you just let the AI handle it. And then when there's a problem, then there's triage from the human side, right? And at each of the levels, there's probably about essentially on average 20, 40, and 70% increase in productivity, respectively. And in some cases, companies were getting on the order of 300 or 400% increase in productivity. So what I was saying was on average. Right.
And when you were talking to enterprise firms, was there a way that they were selecting these use cases? Because something that is highly automatable should be automated, and rather than having kind of humans thrown at it. But conversely, some of the very complex processes, an AI could do it, but probably really does need a human in the loop. Or there might be in a regulated industry where you need that oversight anyway.
Yeah, and it's definitely depending on the industry it's in, and depending on the level of sophistication of the company and the quality of the data they're getting. There's a lot of decision factors, but I think the key was really doing it all iteratively, not saying, hey, I know the right answer, I'm going to fully automate from day one. What usually happens is that they do piecemeal, and then the more they found that actually this works, then they added to it. And that was really the case for pretty much all the implementations that we saw that were successful, was that it was an iterative process. And people essentially continue to increase the level of automation and the level of breadth of coverage of AI across their workflow. And that's what really works, because the industry is moving so quickly and the technology is moving so quickly that anybody who tries to tell you they have the full answer from day one, they either don't know or they're lying to you. So.
And with you referenced the Anthropic Economic Index data, which was showing kind of statistics around actually people using like Claude Code at home is the usage is more collaborative, whereas in the enterprise, people using like Anthropic APIs, it's actually very focused on automation. So what does that gap kind of say about where enterprise architecture is heading in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a difference in terms of end user use versus enterprise use cases. But what the Anthropic paper was showing essentially was that even though in a lot of different types of workloads, existing technology can already cover an order of 80 or 90% of the work, and sometimes more. Essentially, only about 10 to 20% is being automated today. And, a lot of it is because of organizational internal issues, right? And that's what we found also, was that what was holding back the level of integration and the success was mostly organizational issues, incentive issues, leadership issues, as well as security of the people who were involved and an understanding of their role. Right. In fact, one of the biggest blockers of what slowed things down was the staff members, HR, legal, compliance, folks that used to be essentially the gatekeepers. They kept making the gates harder and harder to go, because they didn't want to be responsible for creating a problem. And it really took the leadership at the senior level to step in and say, hey, let these things happen. It's okay to make some mistakes, and let failure be accepted without punishment.
So this point on the adoption curve is very it's okay to fail because it's all learning.
But permission to fail is so important because even though we've mostly focused on cases that were, verifiably successful, 2/3 of them started out as failures, right? And what was really interesting was that every single case where the failure became a success, the leader who was driving the project was the same leader. They didn't replace the guy who failed. They just said, do it again. Now, what did we learn from the last one? And that permission really um, uh, 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 allowed the leader of the project to take chances and actually to innovate and be more experimental, which is what's needed in something that's relatively early in its adoption cycle.
Moving on to the chapter written around kind of data and how clean as an enterprise data needs to be, we've obviously seen a trend over the last probably decade, more than a decade, of trying people knowing that they need to be collecting and capturing as much data as possible, and data lakes and data warehouses and all the different combinations of. One thing that you kind of highlight in the report is that only 6% of implementations had data that's actually AI ready, but also that the companies are using the AI to structure the data as well.
Yeah.
Can you kind of talk to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have this perception that unless the data is perfect, the AI can't do anything with it. And I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago that was probably the case. But now the systems are actually very capable of taking data not only that are not organized, but are maybe of different modes. You have some people with paper, with fax, with emails, with scanned documents, and with Excel files or databases, and they put it all together and allowed the AI to say, hey, find, correlate these for us, and then find the consistency, and then maybe recreate the documents that are paper into digital ones, and they were able to make sense of it. And that was not the case a few years ago. The common wisdom has truth, but the reality has actually progressed beyond it. And you're right. I was very surprised in how low the percentage of companies who actually had properly labeled it and organized their data into all consistent forms and formats, and it's very costly to do that. But even without that, what we found was that the level of productivity gains was very similar in terms of maybe a little bit better, and maybe a little bit narrower for the well organized data. But even when you didn't have perfect data, it was still bringing significant gains.
Yeah, and in the kind of capital markets and commodity space, there's still it's still kind of wide open for that, because a lot of the data and the ways that a salesperson or a trader would quote a price, and all of that, trading fee and OTC markets is all done in chat. People communicating on chat, and that kind of data set is not publicly available anywhere. So that unstructured data is a really good ripe kind of ground for taking AI to standardize it.
Yeah, even that's unstructured, but it's still digital because you could essentially
Yes.
download the
Yeah.
logs. Whereas some of these companies we're working with, they're essentially doing invoices that are on faxes that they had to then scan,
Yeah.
right? So it's even more complex for a kind of real world type of manufacturing or customer service or
Yes.
sales type
Yeah. Yeah.
organization. Yeah. So because we worked across 10 different industries, and across 7 different countries. So it was also different depending on what country. Some countries are still a little bit
Mm.
behind in terms of the digitalization of their workflow.
Was there any consistency amongst different industries? It was on kind of the same plus minus 20%, or was some way ahead than others?
I mean, I think anything that was in the software side, you're going to get better gains because the data is kind of innately organized, right? And code itself, anything that's related to software and coding, they were getting much better gains in terms of refactoring code bases or updating content, or just things that organizations that were used to be already highly digital. Right, those are going to move quickly, and I think that's also what the Anthropic paper was showing, that in the software industry and math or maybe accounting, things like that, AI can do really a lot of the work already, and we're going to have rapid adoption and maybe automation, maybe replacement in those industries faster than you would in more traditional industries.
And you mentioned a report around nearly half of companies that you spoke to saying that their accumulated data is a competitive moat. Did you see that kind of irrespective of industry as well? And is it going back to that piece around over the last few decades, everyone trying to save everything, keep all that data? Is that more important than ever?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely the case, because right now, if you're just looking at intelligence, all the AI labs have essentially sucked up all of the data, the public data that's available to train their systems. So if you want to have a differentiation with other companies in your industry, then having clear lots of customer data, lots of transactional data, industry data, materials data, supply data, etc. Those are going to help you make better decisions, and that was definitely a case across the board. So definitely keep your data, even if it's not organized. At some point, the AI will help you organize it. I mean, it's always better if you already have a system that is more structured, but it's not a requirement.
Yep. Moving on to kind of orchestration of AI and workflows and so on. You make or your chapter is called "When a Foundational Model Choice is Not a Commodity," and like the thing that actually kind of stuck out from the report is saying the durable advantage is in the orchestration layer and not the foundational model. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, so essentially the orchestration layer is what your business, your industry needs to consider, and what kind of, what format your data is in, how do you want it to be outputted, what do these different data mean? Because most AI models are not trained on specific industries. They're trained on very general data, right? And so integrating it into your workflow means creating a good scaffolding, a good harness. And when that's done well, no matter what model you bring in, as long as it's a adequate model, what the customers and these companies are finding is that they get decent results. And then it was really about how do I route it to the right model to keep the cost down, right? Because if you're using the latest and greatest frontier models, it could be $20 or $30 per million tokens. If you're using an open source model, it could be $1 or $2 per token. If you're using a on-premise server, it's essentially the cost of electricity, which is a few cents per hour, right? So, and for a lot of things, you actually don't need the latest and greatest. And what you're also finding is that with the recent generations of open source models, that they are essentially 1 or 2% behind the latest and greatest close, but then they're 1/10 the cost. There really is moving towards a commodity type situation for a large number of use cases. Now, I'm not saying every use cases, because in some cases, let's say you're making, a big program that could take man months or man years to make, and one mistake in there could cost you, very significantly in terms of mistakes, in terms of having time to go fix it, or the cost to your business. In those cases, spending a few extra dollars or a few $1,000s extra on the best model probably makes sense. But if you're just sorting emails and scanning paper documents into digital documents, those things can be done with very commodity existing lower end services for very, very low cost.
And how, if you were a CIO sitting on an AI budget, is there any rules that you kind of took from speaking to lots of people about how to think about building this orchestration layer? Because obviously it's a fast moving market and new models come out every week and the cost keeps coming down.
I mean, I think the key is making sure that it is model independent. right? Because every week there's a different model that could be the best, and you don't want to be locked into a certain one because you never know if either that company goes out of business or that company becomes way behind, and you don't want your capabilities to be restricted by a model choice. And considering the fragility of the market these days and how much these companies are burning, it's not unforeseeable that one or two of them may not be here in a year, right?
So kind of pulling all these threads together, the human oversight, having data as a moat, having orchestration over the models. What's the one finding that you kind of took away from the Enterprise AI Playbook that every kind of CEO or CIO should be thinking about? Or it might be a few things.
Yeah, I think there's a few things beyond what we've talked about, but the key is don't focus so much on the technology. The technology will work itself out. It's already good enough. Focus on the processes, right? Focus on the socializing the ideas, understanding the concerns of your team. Leadership has to be fully involved, right? Not just on day one of the kickoff meeting, but really coming in regularly and having C-level engagement, not just director level or manager level, because all the other organizations need to understand that this is something that is from the top, and they'll support it. Otherwise, they're going to resist it because whether they're afraid of losing their job or whether they're afraid of making a mistake, there's just so many reasons to say no, but very few reasons to say yes, right? And we talked about the whole permission to fail. That is so important, and also aligning the incentive systems so that when gains are made, that people are recognized, not only punished for mistakes, but being rewarded for gains. I guess probably one last thing is, rather than being overly focused on cost cutting, which is unfortunately what most people are looking at, right? They're saying, okay, I'm going to get 50% productivity gains. That means I can lay off half of my people. That's what a lot of the CFOs and then the COOs are focused on. I think for a company to really get the value out of this, they should be thinking about, how can I bring a new line of service in? How can I improve the quality of response time to my customer by 10x? How can I get a new way to use this data to offer something that wasn't available before that keeps my customer more sticky, right? So there needs to be new metrics that goes beyond reducing cost and maybe just pure efficiency, but really looking at growing the business versus just improving profit margin.
And would you say that's where the edge is? Because I think one of the I can't remember the exact numbers, but something like a large proportion, like more than a third, were okay. We're gonna cut headcount. Another more than a third was looking at freezing hiring, and then the remainder is actually
45% said when we get productivity, we're going to cut headcount, right? Which is the natural response today, and we're seeing that it actually does work in terms of increasing your stock prices, as recent examples have gained. But then another 19 to 20% said, hey, you know what? We're just not going to hire. Right. And it sounds easier that, okay, we're not hiring. It's not really hurting our people. But the reality is that, there are people who are graduating from universities every day and they're having a really tough time. So when you add together the two, essentially, 2/3, over 60, 64, 65% of the total, workforce will be impacted. And in places like America, where 60 to 65% are white collar, and those are the most exposed people in the world, and in the UK as well, right? In Western Europe and East Asia, all have around 60% plus exposure to job displacement from cognitive labor, not to mention the automation from robotics and so forth, right? So these are going to be significant impact on society, and it's going to create some real instability risk if this isn't managed well. And I think that the governments need to think about what their role is to either create incentives for people not to fire so quickly, or to essentially reskill or redistribute the workforce versus purely replace the workforce. So these are significant, both I think corporate management issues as well as national governance issues.
And just to wrap up, for people that want to follow you and your research, these are topics that you are researching actively.
Yes. Yeah, so if you can follow me on my Substack, it's just AW Graylin, or I have one actually called the Abundantist Substack. It's about how does the society work in a post-labor, post-scarcity economy. You can also add me on LinkedIn, just A Graylin on LinkedIn and A Graylin on Twitter, or X. So, and if you're interested in finding out more, you can read the book. This one essentially gives kind of how the world will play out in the next 5 to 10 years as AI and other exponential technologies gets more integrated into society.
Okay, Alvin, thank you so much.
No, thank you, Matt. This has been a fun conversation.